Joining me now is Jack Matlock. He was United States Ambassador to the USSR at the end of the Cold War. He's also the author of Reagan and Gorbachev, How the Cold War Ended. And he joins me from Princeton, New Jersey. I want to welcome you to the broadcast. Late last week, the president of Lithuania said that we have the makings of a new Cold War. What's your take on this, since you were there at the end of the last one? Are we seeing the makings of a new Cold War, do you believe?
I don't think it's correct to look at it as a new Cold War. I think what we're seeing today is nothing like the global confrontation that involved us during the Cold War. It's not a competition of two radically different systems, different ideologies. There is certainly as yet no arms race with large amounts of nuclear weapons being built up on both sides and other types. No, what we're seeing today is a lot of rhetoric that was similar to that in the Cold War, but over much, with no disrespect for the issues involved, over much smaller issues, and issues that I think in many cases are based on misunderstandings more than actual fundamental conflicts.
You know, when you look at a war, you define either a winner or a loser, and yet when a Cold War goes away, both sides win. And yet you've written, and I think it's an interesting concept, that the United States insisted on treating Russia as a loser. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, I wanted to clear up another myth, and that is that somehow the United States and NATO broke up the Soviet Union. That's the opposite of the truth. Now, that's a myth that many Russians seem to have, and others, but the fact is we tried in 1991 to help Gorbachev form a voluntary federation of 12 republics. We did not recognize the three Baltic countries as part of the Soviet Union, and we insisted on their independence. But we thought the others would be better off in a democratic federation. And President Bush actually warned against what he called suicidal nationalism. Now, one of the things that is, I'd say, one of the misconceptions that is pushing the other side is the idea that somehow the that Russia was the loser in the Cold War in our eyes, and that we had broken up the Soviet Union, and that was an act against Russian interests. Well, the fact is that the leader, the elected leader of Russia, led the effort to break up the Soviet Union. And we really did not want that to happen. Now, I think one has to bear that in mind. Now, the point that I was making earlier was that over the years, we did treat Russia in ways that seemed to them that they were being treated as a loser. First of all, in expanding NATO the way we did, and in effect leaving them out of it, and progressively, not only expanding but putting bases there, walking out of the ABM Treaty, which was very important to the relationship, and then, of course, acts such as the bombing of Serbia over Kosovo without UN approval. These things, all of which had a reason other than being offensive to Russia, but were taken in Russia as being the acts of someone who thought they had won the Cold War and that Russia was a defeated agent. Now, and at the time, many of us argued against some of these acts, saying that if we go this course, it is going to be very difficult to bring Russia into the sort of full relationship in a Europe united and free, which was our goal at the end of the Cold War. And what we got was a Russian overreaction each time. And then the building up of myths on both sides, a misunderstanding of what happened in the Cold War, a misunderstanding of what happened afterwards. The result of that was that when this crisis in Ukraine burst upon us, our leaders did not have the sort of personal confidence, the personal relationship that, say, Reagan and Gorbachev had developed, and our first President Bush and Gorbachev had developed. And at that time, we were able to sit down quietly and without a lot of public arguments, work out very serious problems. This time, we didn't have that relationship. And that relationship was based, I would stress, on misunderstandings, misperceptions on both sides, and mistakes made by both sides. So I'm certainly not saying that American policy produced this crisis. I'm saying that what has happened on both sides has brought us to a situation where we are not able, as yet, to solve problems like that brought on by Ukraine by quiet diplomacy.
Well, Ambassador,
I hope we can go back to quiet diplomacy.
Let me kind of, you brought up NATO, so I want to talk a little bit about that. Back in the old days, they said NATO was created to keep the Germans down, keep the U.S. in, and keep Russia or the Soviet Union at that time out. Henry Kissinger, in an op-ed piece recently, said Ukraine should not join NATO, a position I took 7 years ago when it last came up. NATO at the doorstep with Russia. Talk to me about, from a diplomatic standpoint, how Russia would perceive that. And you're talking about these misunderstandings. Clearly, the U.S. and the West should have perceived how Russia would react to this, should they have not?
I'm surprised that our leaders did not understand, apparently, how Russia would react. I think it was quite obvious. Not only Dr. Kissinger, many of us have warned all along that it is not in our interest, it's not in East Europeans' interest, it's not in West Europeans' interest to consider places, countries like Ukraine or Georgia as potential members of NATO. That is simply something that should be excluded. Number one, in Ukraine at least, the majority of the people don't want to be a member of NATO. Why any alliance would want to take in a country when the majority of people don't want to be in it is beyond my comprehension. But second, we should understand that Russia, like every other country, particularly large ones, are very sensitive to foreign military bases near their borders.
We're just about out of time. I want to ask one final question, which is, you know, you brought up Gorbachev and Reagan, their relationship. We've heard Putin referred to as Hitler by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And Kissinger also says, for the West, the demonization of Vladimir Putin is not a policy. It's an alibi for the absence of one. This demonization of Vladimir Putin, that's not a way to get an answer to this issue, is it?
Well, no, I think that's most deplorable. I'm certainly not a defender of all the things he has done as the president of Russia, but that sort of abusive language should be excluded from public comment by government officials. It doesn't help one bit, and either to understand the situation or to deal with people we need to deal with.
Ambassador Matlock, thanks so much for your time. Certainly appreciate it.